quick intro. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am your host, Sarah. Please like, share, and subscribe to the stream. We have with us today the one, the only, the master streamer, master debater, Haz Aldeen. Haz, how are you on Sunday?
Good. How are you? Glad to be here.
One of my favorite guests to have on the show, one of the best internet-based fan bases on social media, one of the most enthusiastic debaters in the game. So let's get started. I did want to talk about where I'm kind of having some trouble as a communist, and as someone who's not maybe that well versed in Islam, is how do we explain to people the compatibility of Islam and socialism, or Islam and communism, as because right now we're kind of engaged in this all-out World War III. You have the same kind of vision that I do, this sort of huge world war where all nations, populations are kind of involved. And I'm of the thought that we're going to need communism throughout this and when it's over. So how do we kind of teach or convince or just converse appropriately with our Islamic subscribers and followers, kind of dismissing these preconceived notions that communism absolutely will not work with an Islamic state?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not something I strongly emphasize often because living in a Christian country, a primarily Christian country, you have to be respectful of others' religions, and you can't limit communism to one religion or another. And I think in the, I don't live in the Middle East, but I think in the Middle East, you have a similar problem of sectarianism between Sunni and Shia, and then perhaps even others. And communism should be a unifying phenomena wherever it is among a people, and it should not divide them on the basis of religion. So this is why it's difficult to talk about religion and ideology, specifically political ideology, because as we know, every religion divides, But speaking personally, and um, in terms of how I understand communism, even if I don't strongly emphasize it publicly a lot, for me, the core and the basis of my communist belief is in Islam. And I don't mean this in the sense of I'm a learned scholar who's aware of all of the hadiths and all of the kind of jurisprudential, if I'm saying this correctly, rulings on everything by the various scholars and people over the centuries. But when I understand not only the phenomena of Islam, but just in general the prophets in the Bible, what I see is basically the essence of what communism is. And many people say communism is just about redistributing resources. And, well, it's not. Communism is about restoring justice in the world and to the world, and in terms of how people live amongst one another. And when you read the Bible or you read the Quran, you hear stories not of prophets going around scolding individuals, but them going to societies and seeing that these societies have corrupted and they've fallen, and they've fallen to sin, as they would say it. But this isn't simply because they're not following rules that are prescribed. They're genuinely doing evil things. And even if you're not a religious person, you would say what they're doing is evil, right? So the prophets always had a social context for when they were needed. And especially when you consider the contribution of authors like Michael Hudson, who talk about the significance of debt forgiveness in relation to the prophets. What I think is that the prophets corresponded to what we would call in Marxism revolutions in the productive forces, in the mode of production. And therefore, the corresponding revolutions necessary to adjust humanity to that. And I think there's something very crucial about having that perspective within Marxism, because Marxism says, for example, when there's changes in the productive forces and then in the relations of production, this is where all the spiritual changes and revolutions happen. But why is that necessary? It's necessary because humanity deviates from the path it's supposed to be on out of confusion and out of a lack of correct orientation and remembrance of its premises. This is why Islam says to be grateful. It's a big, strong point in the religion. God is always named as the merciful, right? And the reason you have these two things is because communism restores justice in the sense of reminding societies where they come from. How do we feed ourselves? How do we clothe ourselves? How do we shelter ourselves? How do we take care of our sick? We take all of these things for granted. And when you have phenomena like we're seeing now with rapid automation and the so-called rise of the fourth industrial revolution, people losing their jobs, people falling into debt, you have a widespread chaos in society. And yes, you have people falling into sin. You have women selling themselves into prostitution. You have people losing their homes to the banks and turning to drugs because they have no hope about their future. You have people who simply are left behind by the government and by the society, seen as waste, more or less. You have rotting and crumbling infrastructure. You have increasing lack of respect for the sanctity of human life, and people who see fit to commit horrible acts of brutality on one another as an outlet for the brutality of the world they live in. The cold dog eat dog way that I'm just speaking in the American context, by the way, and I'm sure this holds truth in the Middle East as well. And the symptoms of social chaos, what in Marxism we would call degeneracy, and this is what in the religion, this is what Babylon was. This is what Sodom and Gomorrah were. This is what all the corrupt society. This is what Mecca and Medina were before the Prophet came and brought the message of God. So to me, it's very difficult for me to advertise communism in a religious way, in the sense of saying this is about this religion or that religion, because Christians find it very easy to understand Christianity through communism as well. I'm sure it's true for Jews as well. I'm sure it's true for Buddhists or something as well. I'm not
Well,
here to gatekeep what communism is, but all I can say is that it is necessarily not only compatible, but an expression and manifestation of the innermost sacred beliefs held by mankind. And if it wasn't that, it would have no history. It would have no significance. Whether we're talking about in Russia itself, and yes, there was conflicts with religion, and I can talk about that briefly if you want. But communism was always
I think it's important for you to talk about that, because that's kind of like the place where
right.
people hang their hat on. They're like, well, the Russians weren't kind to religion, so that therefore communism is incompatible with religion. And I'm often kind of stolen from you, or maybe even plagiarized. But the fact that people kind of are pigeonholing communism into the USSR version, and there's a plethora of
Oh
different
yeah.
versions of socialism and communism. So if you could go into that, that would be great.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even in the case of the USSR, how did people make sense of communism? How did people understand that this is correct versus this is correct in terms of the basic wisdom and morality of it? And all you have to do is read the transcripts of Stalin's speeches, and you see he's citing the Bible. He's citing the Bible as a source of wisdom all the time in his writings and his speeches. He who does not work shall not eat. It's from the Bible. And the Soviet Constitution even references this. This is why Vladimir Putin himself said that the moral code of communist builders that they issued in the USSR later on had striking similarities, he said, to the Bible, the same values as the Bible. So they weren't openly talking about religion overtly, and I can explain why that is. But in terms of the unconscious core of where the communist belief was coming from, it comes from the Bible. And I'm sure that in Buddhist countries, they interpret it through the Buddhism, right? In the Chinese context, it's through the Confucianism. So, of course, in an Islamic context, it would be through Islam. But why is it that communism has been hostile to religion historically? And I can actually answer this. So, you have a few different contexts. I'll name three. Okay. One was Prussia, which I believe was a Protestant country, right? Which is the country Marx lived in. In Prussia, after the Napoleonic Wars and after the introduction of modernity, they started to use the church as a way to legitimate not only the state, but the landowners, the bankers, the aristocrats, and people who were starting to basically oppress and choke the peasants. So they would say, basically, there would be a forest that everyone can get wood from, right? And it was like that for hundreds of years. And then suddenly they would say, no, this forest is no longer your property, so you're stealing that wood if you get wood from that forest. And they've been doing it for centuries, right? Like it was their forefathers were doing it, their parents were doing it. And they would try to justify all of these barbaric, inhumane kinds of laws and new policies, which were meant to usher in the rise of capitalism in the name of religion. And the religious authorities would be on their side because whoever controls the money is the one who pays the priest, right? So they would be corrupt, basically. And then the second thing you had going on in Europe at this time in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and by the way, the French Revolution was about what? It was about land. It was about people who were landless, who didn't want to be slaves to their lords anymore, and wanted to have a basic semblance of human dignity. Anyway, the Catholic Church came out against the French Revolution, and the Catholic Church started working with, again, who? The bankers, the capitalists, the aristocrats, and the oppressive, tyrannical rulers. And they used to justify it in the name of religion. So you have a case where people had a sense of right or wrong in their hearts. They knew this was an unjust scenario, but the language that used to be used to communicate our sense of inner belief, which was religion, was being used against them and was being turned against them. And they were left stranded. It wasn't that they were atheists who wanted to destroy religion. They were people who felt like this was an injustice that wasn't being addressed. And if all of these religious forces around them are reinforcing it and continuing to defend the powers that be, of course it's going to create a feeling of animosity toward religion. But these people weren't theologians or theologians. They weren't completely educated in the history of religion. So they had a very superficial acquaintance with it. And let's just say they were off to a very bad start. You know, I mean, when you get primary education, you learn about religion, you learn about all this kind of stuff. But gradually, the leaders of the socialist movement and the communist movement would just be drawn from the ranks of ordinary working people who have no background in understanding much about religion, right? I mean, maybe they knew about church, but they don't know about the deep history of the Bible and the context of it and what was going on, actually. They only know what the churches were telling them. And then the third context, this is finally what I want to say, is the Russian Orthodox Church. And not many people know this, but Peter the Great, who is a Westernizer who brought secularism and all sorts of Western ideas. I even believe he was friendly with Voltaire. I could be wrong about that. He actually did something unprecedented in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. He dissolved the patriarchate. If I'm saying this correctly, the Orthodox Church used to have a patriarch. It's not like a pope, but it's the head of the church. This is the spiritual leader, right? He dissolved that and created the synod, invested in himself and in the government the power to appoint and elect church leaders away from the church. So the church had no independence from the czar. Now, Peter the Great, we all know he wasn't really, some say he was Satanist, some say he was a Freemason, who knows. But he wasn't really, it doesn't seem like he was a very devout person, right? And his westernizing influence saw to the rise in Russia of a basic of a German occupation of Russia, a Germanic ruling class introducing Western notions of private property, in making serfdom. Russia previously didn't really have a strong tradition of serfdom. Yes, peasants were tied to the land, but they kind of owned it in common. They had this mirror system, and this is what was natural to them. Then they brought this brutal alien occupation, basically, of the rise of these landowners and aristocrats in a Junker-style aristocracy, loyal to the Tsar. And then, by the early 1900s, it's a disaster. The Tsar is indebted to foreign banks. You see the rise of brutal forms of capitalism. Peasants being completely kicked off of their land, stripped of their ancestral homes, for being herded into factories, to be exploited by these brutal capitalists. And it's creating so much social chaos and confusion. It's destroying the fabric of society. Prostitution, huge on the rise. The aristocracy, increasingly indulgent and very, very sick and perverse forms of degeneracy. I mean, the reason the Soviets criminalized homosexuality in, I believe it was 1933 or 34, was because actually these aristocrats were starting to engage in the widespread practice of pederastry, where they were molesting children in their bathhouses and so on and so on. And they reigned with impunity. They were untouchable. So this was not a, and the church, indirectly at least, was justifying all this. The church was upholding the status quo, and they were, because the Tsar was considered a holy figure, the Romanov Tsar, by the church. He was considered the leader, right? Because they didn't have a patriarchate anymore. So this is what created the context for Bolshevik animosity to religion. It wasn't because they read the Bible and they were disgusted by it. It wasn't because they hated the prophets or they hated God, or it was because the institution was a huge defender of, ideologically speaking, spirit. They would give a spiritual veneer to this very rotten and corrupt system. And it takes a lot of courage to insist upon your raw and authentic belief in right and wrong, even when all the authorities are saying otherwise. That takes a lot of, you have to think about it. What is better, a pious, holy person who just listens to what all the authorities are saying, or someone who follows the gut instinct given to them by God to know the difference between right and wrong? And I think the former is a very corrupt outlook. I think it's one thing to just have Sodom and Gomorrah and Babylon, right? But it's another thing to have this justified with the veneer of religion. This is even worse, because now you're degrading the religion itself. And even Marx pointed this out. He said, when the Prussian state tries to become a theocratic state and justify itself on the basis of the Christian religion, it debases not only itself, it debases the Christian religion as well. Debases both. You don't have either. You don't have the religion or a state. So I just want to present to people why it is Marx's had an original hostility to religion. And it's very much rooted in this European context. And then, sure, let's talk about the Muslim world.
Well, I think that you brought up some, and actually, some of the people in the chat brought up something that I kind of want to explore. But we've talked about it, kind of Islamic communism and the compatibility of communism with other religions. I'm guessing it's one of your fans, because they're definitely parroting a Haas line of thinking. But he says there's somebody in the chat kind of saying like Judeo-Bolshevism this, Judeo-Communism this, and then the response to that was from what WTF ha. Nazis spoke of Judeo-Bolshevism, and other anti-communists say communism killed Jews. So which is it? And how do we we're kind of in this battle right now with like towing the anti-Semitism line. We
Yeah.
have, kind of this resurgence of white nationalists who are now kind of seeing a place in this movement, which I know you pointed out, the right-wing grifters who were anti-war when it came to Ukraine. And we're kind of getting all of these convoluted ideologies mixed into this conflict, as it always happens with Israel and Gaza. But how do we get away? How do we reconcile these two things? Is it Judeo-Bolshevism that's trying to take over the world, or did communism kill all of the Jews in Russia and then they had to migrate to Israel? Which is it? Both, they're mutually exclusive. Both cannot be true.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the background of Judeo-Bolshevism, because this was a lie and slander that began actually among the pederastic aristocrats of Europe and in Russia, who basically spread this lie through protocols of Zion and so on to attack the socialist movement. Now, why were they calling it Judeo-Bolshevism, or why were they saying Jewry was behind socialism and behind communism? Well, there were a number of prominent Jews like Lassalle and Karl Marx and August Bebel, I believe, and Karl Kautsky, leader of the Social Democrats. So that was a very real phenomenon, right? But what was the deeper, but they weren't, it wasn't enough to say the whole thing was Jewish, right? So why did they strongly emphasize the Jewish element? Well, simple. Because during the Age of Enlightenment and its aftermath, and then with the rise of more forms of occultism like Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy, which became very popular in the Tsar's court and among the aristocrats and other kind of elites of Europe. You also have this with Nietzsche explicitly, right? That the problem with Western civilization is that we've lost touch with the classics, with ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and we have to return to them. And then with that came a strong veneration of paganism, and the belief that the truth of the world and the cosmos, it lies in the pagan wisdoms preceding Christianity. And that the problem with Christianity is that it polluted the core of our Greco-Roman, whatever, civilization with a Judaizing element, and that's Judaism. And what is Judaism? It's a universal religion that says there's one God, there's one truth, there's one justice, right? And they associated that with communism for obvious reasons. So the Judeo-Bolshevism, that was an attack on Christianity indirectly. They couldn't directly attack Christianity because it would make them extremely unpopular. But that was just as much an attack on Christianity. They, with the Judaic element they were isolating in Bolshevism, was exactly the one they would isolate in Christianity as well. The universalism, belief in universal brotherhood and justice, and a sense of equality, and that we're all born before God. There's no master race. There's no lesser race. No one is superior or inferior. To dust we came, to dust we shall return, and so on and so forth. They couldn't directly attack Christianity, but they very rightly saw in Bolshevism a rebirth of the Abrahamic spirit and tradition. So this is why they call, Stalin, he was not a Jew. He was from an Orthodox seminary. By the time that the Nazis invaded the USSR, the Jewish presence in the state was extremely negligible. It was like almost non-existent. There was a few people, and that's it. It was percentages wise, it was nothing, right? They had a bigger role prior, up to 30%, I think, at one point, of some organs and institutions, because they were the only literate and educated people in Russia. They were very urbanized. They had an academic. This is also, by the way, why there was a prominence. The reason there was a prominence of Jews in socialism in general, from Lassalle and the rest, because for a long time, academia was gate kept. So some of the only people who were among the poorer segments of the society who had education historically and could read and write and could have access to these kinds of things, they were Jews, right? Because they had a historical tradition of literacy. The majority of these peasants in the countryside, you had Russia, you had what, 90% illiteracy, right? And no familiarity with any kind of professional, kind of middle class jobs, which Jews predominantly were confined to. So that's part of the background as well. But by the time the Germans invaded the Soviets, there's no Jewish Bolshevism. So what were they really talking about? Well, they were talking about Christianity. I mean, it's in the flag of the Nazis. The Nazis had a swastika in their flag. I mean, do people not appreciate? It's like they have such a paranoid mind. But then I look at Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists, who are using the swastika as the symbol of their entire movement. And then the Nazis put it on their flag, and yet these conspiracy theorists who are so paranoid, oh yeah, that was just a coincidence. They just put it, yeah. So it was paganism versus it wasn't even, it's not even like really rooted in any real religious tradition, I should add. It's not like this was really Hinduism or the Indo-Aryan religions that used to exist. It was Satanism, basically, right? It was an attempt to subvert the established sense of spirituality with a completely new innovation, which used the veneer of these more ancient pre-Christian, pre-Jewish religions as weapons with which to pollute and spiritually corrupt the people. Because think about it this way, right? These aristocrats were basically saying, we are under a powder keg because Christianity preaches some kind of justice. And it leads people to rebel against us. I mean, this is what happened in the German Peasants' War with Thomas Munzer and Florian Geyer. They were millenarian Protestant Christians who said that all the land should be owned in common. And this is what it says in the Bible. And it was one of the most I think it was the most devastating war in Europe besides the 30 Years' War. I could be wrong about that, but it was an extremely big event that's traumatized them for centuries. And all the peasant rebellions, I mean, in the Middle East, everyone knows this as well. All of the rebellions of the oppressed took a religious form. Imam Khomeini in Iran, I mean, he was an exception. Many of the clerics of his time fiercely disagreed with him because they pursued a path of quietism and just submitting to the status quo. He said no. And what did he do? He led the poor. He led the slum dwellers. He led the people in the countryside. He led the workers, you know. And Marxists didn't fully appreciate that until recently. That and in South America, the same thing is true with the liberation theology. It was priests, Catholic priests, who were leading the Latin American peasants and countryside against imperialism and against the status quo. So very recently, Marxists have begun to understand and appreciate the real significance of religion. And I like to use the productive relationship between the KPRF in Russia and the Orthodox Church as an example of a working relationship. I think is productive and can be something of a model going forward.
You touched on something that I actually did an interview yesterday about the degeneracy of the United States, sort of this collapsing empire. Maybe you want to touch on that a little bit, because I'm really kind of excited. I'm a type of person who likes to watch the world burn. You've also said things like our government has brought shame upon our society, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I'm so embarrassed and humiliated. And then we're having gay sex in our Senate hall. So
oh yeah,
and that's not, I mean, I don't really care. It could be heterosexual sex. What the hell is going on? We're kind of watching these, like, sort of grasping at straws, trying to figure out foreign policy, what's going to stick to the wall. There's a circus going on in our Congress. I can't, and I'm kind of I like to dramatize things. So I'm like, it's the fall of the Roman Empire, but really, like, we're in such a state of decadence. I feel like
that tape it pales in comparison to what I don't know what it is or who was involved, but I heard about it, and as far as I know, there was no children involved. So that alone means it pales in comparison to what these senators and Congress people are actually doing behind closed doors. And Madison Cawthorn kind of alluded to this, that they have
And he
these
disappeared.
orgies, and yeah, and they destroyed him. They destroyed his career, right?
Now he's gone. Somebody literally
Yeah,
asked me the other day, "Where's that guy in the wheelchair?" And I said, "Madison." Oh my God, you're right. I haven't
yeah,
heard from him in like a
right.
year.
They buried him because
Yeah.
he basically told the truth. He said the truth of what they were doing, but um I don't think people appreciate what degeneracy really is not simply uh abnormality. That's a big symptom of it, right? But what makes the overall circumstance degenerate is the inability to actually justify what unifies this country. It's the inability to justify the basis of power anymore. It's not legitimated anymore, right? And this leads to a huge level of conceit and arrogance among the powerful. We don't have to justify our existence. They think they're gods, basically. This is why they're doing all these antics and so on and so forth. They think they're immortal. They think they're untouchable. They don't believe, as all wise statesmen did in the history of humanity, that power is a very fine balance. We have to make sure that people's dignity is respected and upheld, or else they're going to come with torches and pitchforks and overthrow us. They've lost this, as all decaying empires have, by the way. They've lost this humility, right? This is another disgusting thing was the White House Christmas tap dance. Did you see that?
What? What?
Did
There's not.
Yeah, that was a mockery, basically, of American people. It was a huge mockery of saying, "Yes, look at us. We're dancing on your sovereignty. We're dancing on your dignity and your rights. There's nothing you could do about it." This is basically what they believe. They think they're gods.
100%. And that kind of segues really well into another question I want to ask you about humility. Ansar Allah, you are a very strong well, we're all big fans of Ansar Allah. Yemen is actually one of my super soft spots. So you recently went on the mother of all talk shows. Aria, if you could play that my dream date video, that would be great. So, I mean, the perfect date does exist, actually. So you have talked about Ansar Allah, this idea of this kind of David and Goliath, these tireless efforts. Now they're talking. There's rumors circulating that the shipping lanes are actually closed. What we showed was a video of a missile that hit another cargo ship. What are your thoughts on the? And now this is another rumor that has recently been confirmed. They're being forced to go completely around the Cape of South Africa. So how about this sort of downtrodden, only recently went into a ceasefire, civil war in Yemen? We have a project in Yemen, so we're very close to the region, but and they've reported that the ceasefire has held in Yemen, but now we have this upsurge, and it's allowed the Houthis and Ansar Allah to kind of regroup, and now they are kind of this driving force behind this axis of resistance. What are your thoughts on this and on the Yemeni armed forces? And then what other options do you think that they have besides Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea?
I think it's a case of how much are you willing to lose? How much are your people willing to stand behind you and what you're doing? And where you're located strategically. And I think Yemen is leading the charge principally because of their honor. And because it's simply a case of they I mean, I said this before, if they wanted to, they could be as rich as they wanted, right? Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that they would have an unlimited funds at their disposal if they sold out to develop Yemen and to become rich and so on and so on. But it's not worth it to them to sacrifice their honor. And this is why they're doing it. They're not gonna. I mean, they're not gonna allow this to happen to people who they consider the same as them right in front of their eyes. So that's the biggest factor. The second thing is what can America and Israel or anyone else do that Saudi Arabia hasn't? They've already been through it, right? The third thing, obviously, is their strategic location, where they're located, which gives them the ability to hold a extreme degree of leverage against the Zionist entity. Moreover, unlike in the case of Iran, it's not going to lead to well, it will inadvertently, of course, but it wouldn't be the same as a confrontation between Iran and America. Yemenis have this, they have less to lose in the sense that they don't have so much infrastructure and so on that can be bombed that's going to wipe them all out. They're tucked into the mountains of Yemen, and they've already dealt with the effects of the Saudi-led invasion. So it won't trigger a nuclear war, so to speak, right? And people will say, "Oh, these are just Houthis that are doing this." So there's a degree of plausible deniability, is what I'm trying to say, when it comes to these events and these actions.
I love
They
that notion that you said, like, they have nothing left to lose. And that's the thing that the West isn't really used to. They're not, or they don't understand that concept of fighting somebody that has nothing left to lose. That's exactly what our colleagues in Yemen said. They said, we will never forgive ourselves if we don't do what we can to save Gaza. The West has no idea what they're getting into. They don't know what it's like to fight people who have nothing left to lose, and that's exactly kind of what's going on. You see these kind of people that have been sort of forgotten about. Who has really talked about Ansar Allah, and now they're kind of making a humongous difference in this war, basically enacting almost a blockade on Israel. It's pretty incredible, and it really, I think the most important thing to draw from this, and you're probably touching on it too, is kind of the optimism that I take from this. The same optimism that I took from Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso. This sort of like, things are possible. Like, things are still possible. There are still victories to be had against this enormous like monster. We can still make these differences, even just these small upstart groups. I think we have a 35-year-old president in Burkina Faso who has kicked the French out of his country. And now we have the Houthis, of all people, who have been downtrodden for a decade in a civil war with the Saudis, have now been the driving force, the original Arabs, the driving force behind this sort of attack on the Zionist entity from the axis of resistance. So I think that that's really cool. Rumors are also circulating, and I want to ask your opinion. Iran Observer tweeted today. Do you have that tweet area? But they tweeted today that other Arab states are actually helping in the circumvention of this sort of blockade. Why? And what does it? What do we do? And how? Like, I mean, I kind of know why, but I just kind of want you to tell our listeners from your perspective, like, how awful is this, and what should we take from it?
um, I'm so sorry, I blanked out for a second.
I do it all the time.
I'm really sorry about that.
No, I
What?
do. I
Yeah.
do it all the time. So recently the Arab states have decided to help circumvent that blockade that the
Oh,
Houthis.
yeah. The intervention. Sorry, I did that thing where I forgot
I do
what
it
it
too.
was. Yeah. Um, well, I'm still optimistic about it because I don't think it's going to be able to amount to anything. I think Saudi Arabia has sort of sent a message that they don't want to. They just kind of want to sit back and see what happens, kind of approach. Probably due to their increasingly close ties with China, Russia, and so on, and interest in BRICS. I don't know how far that would possibly go, but the UAE, if anyone, seems more likely to lead the charge against Yemen if an Arab state is going to intervene against them militarily, because I know they're circumventing the blockade through land routes. But ultimately, I don't think it'll make a difference. I mean, look, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of money. But what else? You know what I mean? Like, they have money, but geopolitically, they're not really the powers in the region, I wouldn't say, I mean, and I think with power in the region comes with the ability to mobilize millions of people, right? It doesn't simply come from the ability to have a lot of money. If that was true, you know, um, the offshore islands in the Caribbean would be the biggest superpowers in the world, right? But it's not. True power comes from the geopolitics, geography, and what people can you mobilize to die for a cause, right? So I think it's going to take U.S. intervention to do anything significant when it comes to Yemen, which I think it's happening. They sent the USS Eisenhower, and that has a huge ability to cause a chain reaction. And as far as circumventing the blockade, there's no way. You can't replace the Red Sea. You just can't do it. You can't replace the Suez Canal. You can't replace the Red Sea. They can try to mitigate it a little bit through the UAE, and they send stuff to the Zionist state for some relief, but it's not going to ameliorate the overall crisis.
I want to talk about your debate tactics. You've been debating kind of all over the internet. You did a recent appearance on Timcast. I don't think we need to play the clip. A lot of people saw it. You've been debating inside of Mario Spaces. You've kind of been drifting around. You've kind of always been known as this cornerstone of this online debate scene that is now seeing a really big surgence. You are known for like eviscerating your opponents. You are a huge fan favorite. I'm a space host, and you're one of the people that people ask for most often. What do you think it is that makes you so appealing? And what insider tips can you give to others about your debate strategy, especially when they're debating these people that are highly trained and specialized in this art and Hezbollah, funded by think tanks, NGOs, intelligence agencies? What do you tell people? Ask me all the time, how do I go into these debates prepared? What is your strategy? And how do you like to formulate your arguments when you're in these spaces against these sort of like very nefarious characters?
Well, you have to know what you're talking about. That's a big thing. You have to know. You have to like actually um, be aware of a lot of facts and a lot of things like that. But besides that, I think a lot of the reason why I'm successful in debates is a lot of the reason I'm blacklisted. You know, and it's not just by enemies, by the way. There's even friendly entities you would think that would be very friendly to me, but they don't. They don't like the whole antics and all the streaming stuff I do, and they look down on me. Really, they do. And if I named them, it would. I'm not going to, but it would be very surprising. But they're basically boomers, very arrogant, and they basically they don't really appreciate what I'm doing out here. But they're interested in the after effects. Like some of them are interested in, oh, what about MAGA communism? But I get erased, right? Because I'm a clown, I'm a silly person. But the theory and the idea behind MAGA communism, I obviously played a very big role in that, to say the least. So when it comes to the debates, I don't have any. It's like I'm the Houthis. I have nothing to lose. A lot of people, I don't care about maintaining an image because that I think that really comes down to a lot of it. It's just like I I try to be very real, and I try to, from a perspective of, I always believe common sense is more important most of the time in these kinds of debates. And armed with facts, I think that's honestly enough. And also, another thing I don't tolerate is disrespect, right? And all of these factors basically lead people to dismiss me. And although I win in these debates and I prevail in them and I succeed in persuading people, it's just like, it doesn't bode well for me on a professional level, which I don't care, because to be honest, a lot of these foreign companies, media companies, they do shit at what they do. They're run by boomers. They completely shit at what they do. And they don't know anything about media. And some of them, they get funding from their states, millions and millions of dollars. They get less viewers than me, So
Yeah, I'm also one of those people that kind of goes in with once you're doxxed and fully out there and everybody has your business, it's like a strategic thing that people do. And then I'm like, you've made a huge mistake because you've taken everything from me. And now I really have nothing left to lose. So that's kind of exactly how I go into conversations. But so I love this phrase that you use. You talk about how Israel is tethered to the United States. And I kind of want to explore like what you mean by that term. And I try to get my listeners to kind of critically think about this relationship between the USA and Israel, because the easiest thing for people to say is Israel's just a puppet state of the United States. I disagree. I really disagree. Why don't you explore this notion, explain the notion of like tethering and what you think was the turning point in the relationship between Israel and the United States, where that control sort of shifted? I mean, what I'm seeing now is that we have this maniacal lunatic state, this rogue state that's kind of doing whatever they want in Gaza. I'm getting the vibe that the United States is at least a little bit hesitant, but they're also at the same time like, we created this monster and we don't know how to get it back on the leash. So what do you think is kind of going on in this relationship dynamic between the United States and Israel?
The U.S. is giving Israel the assurance and guarantee that if they ever find themselves up against the wall, that we're going to go to war for them. And that's the message that's being communicated. So they're allowing Israel to do whatever it wants, and that's enough for them. And they're supplying them with ammunition and bombs. And the U.S. doesn't have to get involved at this stage on the ground at this stage, but they're communicating. At least if it's a bluff, they're at least trying to bluff that this is their strategic stance. If anything happens to Israel, they're going to intervene. But it's unsustainable domestically. It's unsustainable for the domestic situation. I mean, people really underestimate that the United States is a lot closer to a civil war than a lot of people would expect. This is an extremely divided country. People are sick and tired of the government, and they have to simultaneously maintain like policing the world and policing America, and both are they're not working very well, right? So, that's it's not so much that the U.S. has a degree of independence, and this is why they're a little bit distant to Israel. It's more so they understand it's two different perspectives of the same empire. One is in Israel, one is in the United States, and one is saying, "Hey, we're the ones who are responsible for keeping this flock of sheep in check, the American people, and we can't do what you're asking us to do because it's going to jeopardize our situation," right? So I think that's really what's going. It's just a conflict of perspective. It's not a conflict of position. And the Netanyahu government is, it's a very right wing government. That means nothing, right? That Biden says these things like this. This is just kind of like a friendly banter between the same faction. But so the United States people are not going to tolerate a war. And the troops don't want to die for one. And you look at the latest reports, even provided by the Pentagon, of the anti-government sentiment in the military. That there's people in the military who want to overthrow the government, and it's a very widespread sentiment,
I almost wish I was still in the military to experience it. But the recent article did come out from the New York Post, which maybe you're kind of referring to. What you've mentioned boomers already, they're in charge of the media. And then we have this block of 18 to 24-year-olds. And I believe the percentage was 51%, which is still a majority and notable. They're literally, the formulated question was, the long-term answer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was for, quote, Israel to be ended and given to Hamas and the Palestinians. How did we get to here? And I almost want to credit, and maybe you'll help me. This is important. I almost want to give a lot of credit to Russia, because Russia in this last 18 months has exposed how wrong our government and our media are, and as well as COVID, that helped as well, and the vaccine. And now it's kind of like anything that you throw at us, we're going to immediately push back on and kind of give its own, like, give a due diligence. And
that was Trump's immortal gift to American history. I don't care. He did a lot of horrible things. Oh my God, I can't believe you support Trump, as people. You don't see the big picture, okay? Trump made it so that nobody will ever trust anything the government says ever again. And yeah, sure, initially a lot of people were pro-Israel, but just like they were pro-Ukraine. But just time goes on, and then it starts to get popular on TikTok or other social media that, hey, they're lying to you about Israel, just like COVID and just like everything else. Wow, you have the same effect at play. And no, the American people don't want to die for Israel. And look, the George W. Bush era is probably the most humiliating era of American people in history, because we were basically all sitting in stadiums, football stadiums, eating McDonald's, munching on burgers, living a really high life on credit, buying McMansions, and they were feeding us slop, basically saying, oh yeah, American freedom, we have to go liberate. And then everyone was buying into it, and it was just a big orgiastic session of lies and degeneracy and whatever. And this was a horrible time, right? But then what happened? 2008 happens. You know what happens? The truth of the Iraq War comes out, and it's an irreversible memory. There's no way American people are going to go back to the early 2000s George W. Bush era of mass stupidity. And the evangelical churches had a really big role to play in that mass hypnosis, by the way. But here's the thing. People don't know this about evangelicism. It is constantly subjected to its Protestantism, right? It's schisms. So there's new churches, there's new faces, there's new versions of it, and there's new cults, there's new charlatans, there's new leaders. You can't contain the process. You can't centralize it. You know, it's not a Catholic church. So the same evangelical churches back then, I mean, they've evolved, right? Especially in the media atmosphere we're in now. Back then, it was television was the main thing, and now it's a lot of this stuff is coming from the internet. So it's a process of fragmentation of any central sources of information, which ultimately coalesces into two opposing channels of information. I don't care if you believe in reptilians or if you believe in flat Earth, or if you believe in all sorts of different fringe views, or you believe 9/11 was a lie. You can believe anything you want about COVID. Everyone's in one faction, which is the faction that's called we reject the central stream of information being channeled at us. And there's a lot of diversity in that faction, sure, but it's just like two channels of information. One is hegemonic, one is counter-hegemonic. The content of the latter doesn't matter, right? And that's really the main thing I appreciated about Trump, was not his policies. It wasn't the laws that were passed. This is stupid understanding of politics in today's age. People only focus on this. It's how he created an irreversible splinter in the channel of information in the United States, the flow of information. And it's considered by the military a crisis of national security. If you read their papers and they talk about misinformation or disinformation, which they attribute usually to a foreign source, this is what they're actually talking about. They're talking about how we don't have MTV anymore and cable television dictating what we believe anymore, you know, and it's irreversible.
I just have two more questions if you have the time, and they're kind of both about our favorite, Russia. So there was a recent military analyst, Greg Stoker. He compared Gaza to Stalingrad, and I think we have a clip of his statement.
So it's the 13th, and as atrocities continue to mount in the Strip, the IDF just released the names and ranks of casualties from today, and it is wild. There's a lieutenant colonel, 3 majors, a captain, 2 non-commissioned officers, and then a pretty high-ranking non-commissioned officer. And you might be like, wait, where are all the privates and the corporals and the lower enlisted? Well, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to unpack this whole thing. But this is Stalingrad, dude. This is Stalingrad. This is a battle everybody studies because it was a huge blunder for the German army. They invade Russia, and they bomb and shell Stalingrad into rubble. Sounds familiar. And one of the biggest advantages the German had were their tanks and their armored vehicles, which, because of the rubble, couldn't really maneuver the way they should have. And they really nerfed themselves against the Russians because the Russians knew their own rubble of their own city better than they ever would. So they had like ambush positions, fixed fighting positions, and scary sniper positions. And that is actually one of the defining aspects of the battle, because these Russian snipers would just target the officers and leave the lower enlisted men alone. And it would break morale as their officers kept having to get replaced over and over and over again. Only time you see casual.
So I like this comparison because we're hearing that a ton of Israeli officers are being killed in Gaza. I also like the comparison for the symbolic reference. What are your thoughts on it? I like it because the resilience of both the Russians and the Gazans. And
I think
this parallel I see a parallel between Donbass and Gaza. So I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are.
I agree. I mean, you know what? It is the same thing in a way, because ultimately you have a two seemingly driving forces of history, right? People who are attached to their land, are attached to some kind of collective being, some kind of communal existence, based in honor, based in dignity, and so on and so on. And then forces which seek to violently uproot them from that context and basically turn them into this lamb-like, vulnerable subject to be exploited, to be brainwashed, to be killed, to be abused, to be turned into a slave, basically. I mean, you see this throughout history, going even back to ancient times, right? As early as the Michael Hudson talks about this, as early as Athens before Ceylon, where people were becoming so indebted to creditors, they were getting uprooted from the land that they lived on and tilled ancestrally. They had to sell their children, they sold their wives to pay back the debts, and so on. It's a universal phenomenon, right? And there are forces of humanity that try to defend the human existence. And then there's forces of there's anti-human forces which seek to exterminate what we call a human existence. In Donbass, it's the same. The Maidan coup was led by it wasn't just that they're neo-Nazis in the sense that they're bigoted and they're backward. Not really. They're not really backward. They're really advanced in the sense of epitomizing the most avant-garde cultural trends of internet-based subjectivity, very much compatible with the Reddit subject who loves video games and whatever, CD Projekt Red, I don't know. So this was the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They're violently abstracting from the context of actual tradition, which is tied to the lineage of the Soviet Union in Ukraine. And this is one of the most core distinctions, It's like in the Liberian, if you've ever seen the movie Blood Diamond, this was true for the civil war in Sierra Leone and Liberia. You have kids taken from their villages, coked up on drugs, given a cocktail of drugs, and being taught to become killers, like killing civilians, raping, whatever, and turning against their communal existence, right? And this is what was going on in a different kind of way with the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They became this kind of anarchists, basically, right? And I have a famous saying that Hitler was an anarchist, by the way. But anyway,
saying that I am the Mongoloid, which I've been hearing a lot lately. So
yeah. So in the case of Gaza, you have a similar thing, and Israel has no roots in the region. It's not a communal existence. It's a mishmash of people from all over the world who have nothing to do with each other. You talk to people who live there, and especially in Tel Aviv and stuff, it's like it's not a very civilized country. You go to they're very rude. It's worse than America in a lot of ways in that regard, right? And yes, they're held together by a common religion, but what does that mean if you don't have a common culture? It's not like they're all religiously observing. Most of them aren't. They're completely secular. So It's a completely artificial and synthetic form of human existence, which is incompatible with the organic, natural kind. So, especially regionally speaking, it doesn't have civilizational roots, right? So when the people of Gaza are defending themselves, in the this is what was going on in Stalingrad itself. This is what the Nazis wanted to do to the Slavs and the Russians in their own ancestral homelands, to depopulate Ukraine, depopulate Russia, and settle German colonists there. So it's literally the parallel actually is real. I want to say one last thing, because no one points this out. Speaking of relation between the Red Army and people fighting in Gaza, you know that red triangle, you're familiar with it. It's so strange because, as anyone who's familiar with the Red Army propaganda in the early 20s and the October Revolution, the red triangle, which is beat the whites with the red wedge. It's a famous painting by L. Lissitzky, who is a student of Malevich and the kind of art of abstraction. And I think there's a strange vengeance of the red wedge in Gaza. I don't think it's a coincidence. So I'll just say that.
That's actually really beautiful, and I really love the parallel that you drew between the kind of Ukraine and Israel, not just Donbass and Gaza. This actually makes the case even stronger. This case of the Ukraine, because Ukrainians also do this. They define their state and their people, their nation, by being the antithesis of something else. They define themselves by saying, "We are not Russians." That's who we are. We are not Russians. And for Israel, everything about the Israeli state is trying to be an antithesis to Islam. So we have mosques in Tel Aviv that have been converted into sex clubs. We have things that they do just to be disgusting, just to be degrading. So and that's exactly how Ukraine is. So I really love that you brought that up. Area, cue the clip from Ukraine. Let's see how bad it is there, and then we will wrap this baby up. So winter has come. And for the second year in a row, Putin has weaponized the weather, and all Western equipment is stuck in the mud. What are your thoughts about the current state of the Ukrainian conflict? I think it's completely done. I don't know what we're still doing. I was asked yesterday, and I really couldn't answer the question. I was actually asked again today if I thought Israel was the exit strategy for Ukraine, and I'm still not making that firm connection. Israel looks like an even worse blunder. What are your thoughts? Where do we go in the Ukraine conflict while trying to placate Israel? And then we have Taiwan, and we also know about Venezuela, which you've posted about, and so have I. How do all of these things happen simultaneously? And what are your thoughts on Ukraine at this current state?
In Ukraine in isolation, it seems like we're looking at an off-roading of the conflict. I mean, the end is in sight, seems like. But in the wider context, I think we're looking at the exact circumstances in which a world war would happen. And the opening up of multiple fronts globally, and that there are alliances already being made. But what I really don't like is the alliance between Russia, China, and Iran is nowhere near as strong as that between NATO. And this is the problem. And we shouldn't be afraid to observe this political reality that there are reformist, let's call them, pro-Western elements in the Russian government. There are reformist elements in the Iranian government. I'm sure there's forces in China as well who are acting as fetters and obstructing the consolidation of the powers of their own country, you know? And this is an unfortunate reality we have to be very sober about. If someone who lives in America, me, I don't place my faith in these countries. I wish them the best. I support them almost unconditionally pretty much, right? But I'm not going to sit around and wait for them to realize the reality I want to see. I'm going to fight for it in America. And their problems are not my problems. Like, I'm not going to make a career off of critiquing them because I don't live in Russia, I don't live in China, I don't live in Iran. I live in America. But I think there is a global atmosphere of a world war brewing, and I hope, it's my hope, that these three powers in particular get their act together and can form an alliance and not sell out at the most opportune moment, which is what I fear, right? Due to the internal political forces. There is a calling for Eurasia to rise, and they must be worthy of this calling. And it'd be a big shame if they weren't. That's all I could really say.
Well, I can't think of a better point to wrap up on. Why don't you tell everyone about your project? I know you're working really diligently on the MAGA communism and the infrared community. So why don't you tell our listeners where they can find those things and how they can get involved?
So I haven't announced an organization that I'm going to be launching in the future, but there will be more details about that. I'm currently wrapping up a book which is going to be about Marxism, Leninism, and political philosophy. And it's going to be a little bit of a difficult read, but it will be definitely worth it.
Would it be you if it wasn't a difficult
read? And that's going to be published pretty soon. And ultimately, my focus is really on building communism in the American context. And what is communism? You have to go back to the theory. You can't superficially just say, I want this policy, I want this kind of system. You need to go back to the philosophy, where it came from, is what I think. And this is kind of where I have my strong focus at the moment, is what are the philosophical and spiritual roots of communism? And I think everyone has that to look forward to, because what I can promise and guarantee is a new perspective.
And this is so important because we touched on this in this episode, this weird, and they're doing it in the chat too. Nobody knows what communism is or even how it can apply to America. So make sure you guys follow Haz on Twitter. And if you want to know more about MAGA communism, go to Haz's Kick. You're not on Twitch anymore, right? His Kick stream. And then as well as our previous episode with Haz on the stream where he talks more about MAGA communism in depth. Hopefully, Haz, we can pressure him to come into our spaces more. But thanks again,
well,
Haz.
bring people to debate, and if I'm streaming, I'll come.
You guys hear that? Bring people to debate and then go link Haz on his stream. Thank you so much, Haz.
Thank you.
As always, and we will talk soon. Like, share, and subscribe to the stream. Subscribe to the Substack. Big things are coming. We'll be doing an episode on Yemen this week, and David Miller from Palestine Declassified will be with us. Thanks again, and we will see you later.
Thanks for having me.